I motioned to the bartender. He made with the whiz and the soda. I took out a cigarette, and he lit it for me, smirking and giving me a wink.
Quite a dish, huh, sir? Really well-stacked babe.
What babe?
You didn't notice her? The one that just went by? Pretty little girl with so much above the belt she can hardly see over it.
Yeah, I believe I did notice her. Went by when I was getting some air, didn't she?
That's the one. Lives around here someplace, I guess. A real hot customer from all I hear.
No kidding. I thought she looked like a pretty nice girl.
They tell me it's pretty simple. From what I hear, all you gotta do is give her the old proposition.
Just like that, huh?
So they tell me. They tell me it's just a matter of, how's about it, Toots? And you can get out the coal shovel.
He nodded, giving me another wink. I picked up my change, every damn penny of it, and left. I drove around a while, got myself some coffee, and ate a handful of mints. It was that time by then, so I went to the store and checked in. There was no hurrahing or needling from Staples. Maybe he'd decided there wasn't anything he could nose out. Anyway, he checked me out fast, and I went home. Everything was about like it had been the night before. A good dinner, Joyce being nice despite the way she was worried about the money. I couldn't think of much to say to her talk, so I just let her ramble on. At one time I got to frowning unconsciously, staring around the living room. I wasn't really thinking about it at all, but she thought I was.
I'm sorry, darling. I've been meaning to clean the house from top to bottom. I'll get busy on it first thing in the morning. You won't know the place when you get home.
Let it go. It looks okay to me.
No, I'm going to do it. It'll help to take my mind off of...
The next day was Thursday. Like the other days since Joyce had come back, it started off good. Breakfast was ready and waiting for me. Joyce was swell. There was no mention of the case in the morning papers. I thought, well, everything else is so good, that goddamn Staples will probably give me a hard time. But I was dead wrong about it. I was the first guy he checked out, and he didn't waste any time. I went back around the corner and climbed into my car. I backed away from the curb, and I don't know where she'd been hiding, waiting, in some doorway, I guess, but suddenly there she was, Mona, piling into the car with me, scared. So scared I could hardly understand her.
Something's wrong, Dolly. The police are following me.
The police? Great God, the police were after her, and she'd led them right to me. My foot slipped off the clutch, and the car leapt forward. I jammed my foot down on the gas. Inside of 2 blocks, I was doing 70 right through the early morning traffic, and God, I don't know how I kept from being pinched or from smashing into someone. Then I began to think again, and I slapped on the brakes. But I didn't stop. The hell the police were following her. I knew damn well they weren't. But I wanted to get her away from the store neighborhood. If Staples saw us together, it would be just as bad as if the police were on our tail. Now, what's this all about? I said finally, heading the car toward the country. I know the police aren't watching you. I told her about the afternoon before, how I'd wanted to see her, but the important thing was to take care of her, make sure that everything was okay, so I'd taken time off from my job, gone to all kinds of trouble, and done it.
But they don't do it in the daytime, Dolly. Just at night. Tuesday night and last night.
How do you know they were police?
I don't know, but I supposed.
Well, tell me what happened. Start with Tuesday night.
I was just going out for a walk, Dolly. That house, I've hardly been able to sleep since...
Well, never mind, damn it. Just tell me what happened.
This car, it was parked up at the next corner, right where whoever was in it, could watch the house. And just before I got to it, they turned the lights on me. I went by, and the car started up. It turned around in the street and began to follow me. I walked 5 or 6 blocks, and it followed me until I turned the corner to go home.
Well?
I went for a walk last night, and the same car was there. It was over on the other side of the street, and they didn't turn the lights on, and I started walking pretty fast, so I didn't hear it when it started up, but I'd only got a block when...
Oh, sure. And it followed you back to the corner again?
Yes. Well, no, not quite. You see, there were quite a few cars passing, and...
I see. Boy, did I want to paste her, scaring hell out of me, coming down around the store where Staples might have seen her. Are you even sure it was the same car? What kind of car was it, anyway?
Don't know. I think it was the same as this one.
Do you know how many cars there are like this one on the road? About 8 million.
Then you don't think...
I shook my head. I couldn't trust myself to speak. She saw how I felt, apparently, and she shut up, too. How stupid could you get, anyway? It wasn't enough that she was a tramp. She had to be stupid on top of it. I drove along toward the country, calming down. I began to feel sorry for her, to think that I couldn't really blame her for losing her head. I started talking again, dropping in a sweet word now and then. I explained to her what had happened, that there wasn't a thing in the world to be scared about. She couldn't believe it at first. She'd been knocked for such a loop that she couldn't see the truth when it was pointed out to her. But finally she did. We were in the country by then. I turned off the highway and parked. She leaned toward me a little, smiling kind of timidly. I put my arms around her. I could feel her, the warmth and the softness. I put my mouth to her ear and whispered, "How's about it, Toots?"
What? Oh. You mean here? In the daytime?
What the hell? You know the score. You ought to know it anyway. She didn't say anything, but something happened to her eyes. They went as sick as a dog's, and I moved my hands away from where they had been and just hugged her tight around the shoulders. I'm sorry. I talked pretty rough, you know, and I just wasn't thinking how it sounded.
It's all right, darling.
Now, forget I said it, huh? I didn't mean a thing. I gave her a big hug, and for a moment I forgot all about Joyce. You're the sweetest girl in the world. We'll hang around town 2 or 3 weeks, longer, just to make sure. Then we'll pull out. And there won't be any past, baby. Just the future. And she snuggled up against me. I held her and patted her for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Then a string of cars started to go by, and we had to move apart.
Dolly, I don't like to bother you, but...
You couldn't bother me. You just tell old Dolly about it, and if he can fix it up, he will.
Could I see you tonight? I get so scared in that house. If I could see you for just a little while before I went to bed.
There was still some of the sickness and hurt in her eyes. Not a whole lot, but it wouldn't take much to make it into a lot. I couldn't have her think I was slapping her down again. Well, I sure'd like to, but it might not be too smart if someone should spot me over there around your place.
Let me come over to yours, then. Please, Dolly, just for a few minutes, and then I won't ask you again until it's all over. You meant that about the police? You're sure they're not watching me? You're not afraid to have me?
I said I was sure. I wouldn't snore about a thing like that. It's this way, honey. My boss, Staples, the guy you took the bail money to, well, he drops out a lot in the evening to talk about the work, you know. And if he saw you there, it would blow things higher than a kite. He was pretty suspicious about that dough anyway. I wasn't supposed to have any, and you're sure not supposed to have any. We're not supposed to mean a thing to each other. So if he found out... She was nodding almost impatiently. She understood about Staples. But that still didn't take me off the hook.
I could come later, Dolly. Any time. Midnight. He wouldn't be there that late.
Well, yeah, sure, but,
Oh,
now, wait a minute. I'm trying to explain, honey. It's kind of hard to put into words, but,
I understand.
I couldn't have her feeling that way, not at this stage of the game, anyway, when she was still so shaky that she could hardly cast a shadow. Why don't we do this? Suppose you come over around 9 o'clock, and I'll meet you outside. I'll say, in case someone's there, that I want to get some cigarettes, and I'll meet you down the block from the wrecking yard, on the corner by the drugstore.
If you're sure you want to.
I'd love to. I just wanted to play it safe. I made her believe it. I said I'd been worried about her being without dough, and I started to reach back to my sample case. And then I caught myself and took out my wallet. I gave her $5 of my own money. We talked a little longer, and then I drove her to the bus stop and let her out. I didn't feel like working that day either, but I put in a few hours just to pass the time. I took in around $20, padding it out with $40 from the satchel. The rest of the day I just fooled around, and at 6 I checked in. Staples was okay. I mean, he didn't give me the needle. I was out of the store in 10 minutes and on my way home. The gravel cars had been pulled off the siding, and 3 gondolas of coal were there tonight. One of the cars was sticking halfway out into the street, and it was a close squeeze getting the car past it. I finally made it, and I parked and went into the house. I called to Joyce. Her voice came back to me faintly from the bedroom. I glanced into the dinette. Dinner was ready. It was on the table, but there was only one place setting, mine. I set down the sample case, took off my hat and coat. I hesitated, and then I went back to the bedroom. I paused in the doorway. It didn't seem like I could go any further, and stood looking in at her. She was in bed with the covers pulled pretty well over her, but I could see she had on her nightgown. She was facing the wall, her back to me, and she didn't turn around. You sick or something, honey?" She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, her voice muffled,
"I don't feel too well. Go and eat your dinner while it's hot, Dolly."
"Where are you sick, anyway? What's the matter?"
"Eat your dinner. We can talk afterwards."
"Well, okay. Maybe I'd better." I didn't have much of an appetite for some reason, but I ate. I ate slow, taking my time, and I drank 3 cups of coffee afterwards. And when I couldn't hold any more coffee, I started smoking, lighting one cigarette after another. She called to me. "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute, honey." I finished my cigarette. I got up and went down the hall toward the bedroom, and I got there, and I couldn't make myself go in. I said, be with you in a minute, baby." And I went into the bathroom and closed the door. I looked around in there, and it was like I'd never seen the place before. Nothing had been done to it, but something had happened to me. Everything seemed strange, twisted, out of shape. I was lost in a strange world, and there was nothing familiar to hang on to. Nothing, no one I could talk to, explain things to. I sat down on the edge of the tub and lighted a cigarette. I crushed it out in the sink without thinking, and then I got up and crumpled the butt into shreds and washed the shreds down the drain. I washed the sink out until there wasn't a spot or a stain left on it. I sat down on the toilet and lighted another cigarette. I stayed there in the bathroom. It was a strange world, but it was even stranger outside. I could sit here and explain to myself, and it was clear as daylight. But I couldn't explain to her. She called to me. I yelled that I'd be out in a minute, and I stayed where I was. She called again. I yelled again. She came to the door finally and knocked, and I yelled, "For Christ's sake, what's the hurry anyway?" And she turned the knob and came in. She'd been crying so much and so long that she was cried out, and now her face was drawn, streaked with tears. But her eyes were clear and her voice was steady.
"Dolly, I intend to know, so don't try to lie to me. Where did you get that money?"
I told her. I said, "Hell, honey, I already told you where I got it." And she said, "You lied, Dolly." I must have known it right from the beginning, but I wanted so much to believe that...
"Where were you Monday night, Dolly?"
"Monday night? Oh, the night you came home? I was out collecting, baby. I caught up with some long-time skips, and they paid off like..."
"They did not pay off, because you weren't collecting."
Now, wait just a minute. I told you about it at the time, told you exactly where I'd been. You saw the money I took in, and...
"I saw you take some money out of that little bag and put it in your wallet. That was all you had, Dolly, except for $1 or $2. I could see that it was the next morning when you took the money I brought back from my trip."
I shrugged. I gave her the cold eye. Hell, what if I hadn't told her the whole truth? Was that any reason for her to break into the bathroom and accuse me of lying and act like I'd committed a crime or something? I will leave you to be the judge, dear reader. All I will say is that if you insist on putting yourself on a spot, pushing a man who has already been pushed too far, you've got to take the consequences.
"How well did you know Pete Hendrickson, Dolly?"
Pete Hendrickson? I never heard of him in my life.
"He was killed Monday night. He and a woman named Farrell."
Oh, yeah. Seems like I remember reading something about it.
"You didn't know him personally?"
Know him? Why would I know a character like that?
Then why was he in this house? Why did he sleep here?
My God, honey, I said, that's the screwiest thing I ever heard of. Whatever gave you the idea that...
This. I cleaned house today, and I found this down on the floor behind the bed.
She opened her hand and held it out. A little blue and white card. Pete Hendrickson's Social Security card.
Why did you tell me you didn't know him?
I know a lot of people. I just didn't see that it made any difference.
Then he was with you Monday night, wasn't he? Monday evening, before before it happened.
What if he was here? What if I wasn't collecting that night? Don't you...
That's what I want to know. Why you lied to me if it didn't matter.
Don't you trust me? Don't you love me? Maybe I did get a little mixed up and forget a few things, but she moved away from me, shrugging my hands off her shoulders.
Why, Dolly? Where were you Monday night, and where did you get that money?
God damn it, leave me alone. I didn't like to talk to her that way, understand, but why did she have to give me a hard time, and all over nothing?
I'm waiting, Dolly.
I already told you. Maybe it wasn't the truth exactly, but that doesn't mean I did anything wrong. My God, you act like you thought I'd beat the old woman to death and shot Pete, and where do you think you're going?
Oh, Dolly, what have you...
I tried to tell her then what had happened, how things really were, how they could have been, and how did she know that the old woman wasn't a kidnapper and that this money didn't belong to Mona's wealthy parents who had died years ago? She wouldn't even listen to me. She was tugging at the doorknob, staring at me with her eyes getting wider and wider like I was a goddamn maniac or something. I made a grab for her, just trying to make her listen to reason, and for a moment I thought she was going to scream, call for help against her own husband. But she didn't. All she did was say,
Don't know what you're doing. You can't, Dolly. No, please. No! I'm pregnant!
It was too late to stop. Anyway, how could I have stopped, even if it hadn't been too late? I hooked her, and she went down in the bathtub. I bent over the tub, and when I finally stripped off the nightgown and lifted her out, she didn't look like Joyce anymore, or anyone. I carried her out the back door. I tossed her body up on the top of one of the coal cars and climbed up after it. I dug down in the coal with my hand, scooping out a long, shallow hole, and I buried her in that. Buried them. It was enough for one night. It was too much for a million nights, and I came back into the house feeling relaxed. You understand. Nothing else could happen now because everything had already happened. The worst. They couldn't throw anything more at me after this. I washed and cleaned up, thinking, but not worrying. They couldn't identify her. That train would be 3 days getting into Kansas City, and it stopped a half a dozen places between here and there. They wouldn't know where it had happened, when she'd been put onto the coal car, who she was. Mona could stay here with me tonight. Why not? The deal was on ice, and she was one swell kid. And I needed someone to be with me. I've always needed someone to be with me, and tonight... So she'd stay here tonight, and in the morning I'd quit the store, pick an argument with Staples, and then tell him to go to hell and walk out. And then Mona and I would take off, just the two of us, and that good old $100,000. I went out into the living room and had a good stiff drink. Seemed like it should have been awfully late, but it was only a little after 8:30, almost 25 minutes before I was to meet Mona, before someone would be here with me. I poured another stiff drink. I drank it, and I got to thinking it couldn't have happened. So much, so quickly. Maybe I ought to take her back a little drink since she wasn't feeling well, and I poured it out for her and drank it. There was a knock on the door. I gave a little jump, and then I went to answer it. And I didn't hesitate, because there couldn't be anything ever again, and there was nothing to be afraid of. I opened the door. Staples said, "Good evening, Frank," and walked in past me. "Well, Frank, you don't appear at all pleased to see me. Aren't you going to ask me to sit down?" "What the hell do you want, Stape?" He sat down, crossing his fat little legs. "What do I want, Frank? I'll be quite happy with potluck. I'll take whatever you have." I sank down in a chair across from his. I didn't know what to say or do, so I just shook my head. "Oh, yes, Frank, yes, indeed. No, I won't. What do you want? What are you talking about?" He laughed softly.
"Frank, you've been so clumsy, so obvious from the very beginning."
"I don't know what you're talking about."
"Well, if we must, we must. I'll spell it out very slowly. Item 1, Frank. On the day before your arrest for stealing company funds, you collected some $38 from the late Pete Hendrickson. On the same day, you made a cash sale, or rather you turned in a cash sale contract, in the amount of $33 to one Mona Farrell. In the morning, then, on these two accounts, you should have checked in about $71. And frantic as you were to stave off arrest, you certainly would have turned it in if you had had it. But you didn't. All you had was the money for the silverware. You used Pete's money, or most of it, to buy the girl a present.
Now, wait a minute. That doesn't mean you can't prove.
Prove? Well, perhaps not if we take it out of context, which happily I am not forced to do. And at the moment we are not discussing proof. I am merely pointing out your initial error, delving down to the center strand of that very ugly rope which you have hung around your neck. You gave the girl a $33 present, and perhaps that is meaningless of itself. But it is not meaningless when this same girl arrives at the store and bails you out to the tune of more than $300. Or are you going to tell me that it wasn't the same girl?
There was no use in denying it. I knew now who'd been watching her, who'd turned the car lights on her. So I know her, I like her, and she likes me. What of it? My wife skipped out, and
please, I'm not at all interested in your morals. Nor in you personally, for that matter. Only in the money you obtained from what must be the two clumsiest murders on record.
Money? Murders? I don't know what you're...
Please, Frank, you're trying my patience. The girl tipped you off to the fact that the old woman had a substantial sum of money. You, skipping over the gory details, you got it, and still have it, except for those amounts which you checked in as collections.
Now, wait a...
Would you like me to show it to you? Approximately a dozen bills supposedly collected from an assorted group of people, but with their serial numbers in sequence. You got it, Frank, and you got a very substantial sum. Nothing less would have tempted you to take such a terrible risk. And Ma Faraday was just the woman to have had a hefty chunk of cash.
Ma Faraday?
You recall my telling you that I'd been to visit an old friend? That was Ma, better known locally as Mrs. Farrell. I went to see her in the morgue after my suspicions about you became aroused. Once I recognized her, I was certain that... But I see you don't recognize the name. A little before your time, I imagine. But the Faraday gang was notorious in the Southwest some 20 to 25 years ago. Bank robbers, Ma and her three sons, Ma doing the planning and the three men faithfully carrying out her orders. And their wives and children, they all lived together near the town where I worked. Yes, Frank?
Nothing. I thought...
I know. I was confident that your interest in the oil business in my early days in Oklahoma was something more than casual. But no, there was no oil on the Faraday property. Being a very clannish lot with little trust in the law, their neighbors protected and put up with them for years. In the end, however, they finally became so outraged that they moved in and massacred the lot of them, wiped out the entire family. Supposedly.
Mona, she was part of an outfit like that. No wonder she'd been so ready to kill her own aunt, her grandmother probably. No wonder that she'd acted like...
I said supposedly, Frank. A number of bodies were found in the smoldering ruins, also the charred remnants of a quantity of currency. Ergo, in the absence of proof to the contrary, it was assumed that the entire family was wiped out, and with them their ill-gotten gains. But you and I know better, don't we, Frank?
He winked at me, grinning with his puffy little lips drawn back from his teeth. My stomach turned over, and I began to tremble. I felt a scream crawling up from my throat, and I had to swallow hard to choke it back. You've got it all wrong, Stape.
You're such a tiresome fellow, Frank.
It's the God's truth, Stape. The girl was kidnapped, see? She was actually the daughter of a very wealthy family, and the money was ransom money, and... He laughed out loud.
And you are going to act as custodian of it, eh? My dear boy, I'm almost embarrassed for you.
It's true, goddammit. It had to be true. Something had to be true besides what was true. That's why the old woman didn't spend any of the money. She found out it was marked, and... But it wasn't marked, Frank. I know it. You must know it also, unless you're a much bigger fool than you appear. Well, then she found out. She figured out that the serial numbers had been recorded, and then why, since it was unspendable, did she keep it all these years? And why, if the authorities are on the lookout for those serials, why aren't you in custody? You don't know that the money isn't hot. She could have found out that... Oh, Frank, God damn it, you can't be sure, Stape. I not only can be, but I am. You see, I had dealings with the Faradays at this store I managed, delivered merchandise to their mountain retreat at considerably above the market prices. There was nothing criminal about our association, nothing provably illegal, I should say. Enough of personal history. My point is that the Faradays were strictly bank robbers. But they might have pulled one kid. Stop it, Frank! How much did you get, and where is it? I looked down at the floor. I looked up again, keeping my eyes away from the corner where the sample case was. She didn't have as much as I thought, just $10,000. I got it out in the country, see, but I can bring it in the morning. 10,000? You mean 100,000, I'm sure. All right. So, goddammit, there's 100,000. Come on with me, and we'll go get it. Very well, Frank, but perhaps I should tell you something first. I left a letter with the night clerk at my hotel. A very reliable man, incidentally. He's instructed to mail it if I fail to return by midnight. His smile spread, and he laughed out loud again. I thought, it can't be like this. And I guess I must have said it. But it is, Frank. It is like that. Now you will produce the money. Immediately. I brought the case over to the coffee table and snapped it open. I started to reach in for the satchel, digging it out from under the samples, and he brushed my hands away and grabbed it himself. He opened it. He made a funny purring sound. Wonderful. I hope you won't think I'm greedy if I don't offer to share with you. You got to, Stape. A few grand. Well, $1,000, something. Anything. I did it all, and so sorry, but I'll be happy to give you a word of wisdom. You have no problems which money will solve. You son of a bitch. You really don't, Frank. You'd be just as miserable with the money as without it. Well, much as I hate to leave such pleasant company... He buttoned his coat and stood up. He tucked the money satchel under his arm. I want that silverware contract back. By God, you'll never be able to hold that over me. Oh, yes, to be sure. And very shrewd of you. You can pick it up in the morning. Get your wages to date at the same time. My wages? Well, no more questions? You're not wondering why I delayed calling you to account until tonight? Get out. The girl, dear boy, the clinching bit of proof. I didn't really need it, but get out. Of course. But shouldn't you invite her in, Frank? She's just around the corner. And you do look so lonesome. Lonesome, he said. And I had all kinds of company. All kinds. All dead. All jumping up in front of me wherever I looked. All laughing and crying and singing in my mind. All dead. And all for nothing. All for a dame that had been born rotten and got more rotten every damn day of her life. I met her and brought her back to the house. I told her about Staples and losing the money. I laid it out cold for her, kind of hoping, that she'd bitch or give me a hard time about it. But she didn't let out a peep. She was sympathetic, sorry on my account. But she acted like it didn't matter to her. As long as she could be with me, that was all that mattered. I began to think that maybe I might be mistaken about her, to feel that she was the swell kid I had thought she was in the beginning. It was pretty hard to swallow, and of course I couldn't sell myself completely. But I did it enough to keep from slugging her, enough to put up with her, for the time being. She was all I had, you see, and all I'd got for all I'd done. And I had to have someone with me. I'd almost always had someone with me. I went out and got some more whiskey. It took just about my last nickel. I came back and we talked and drank, and after a while she talked and I drank. and pretty soon there was no more talk and only me, drinking. She fell asleep with her head in my lap. I passed out. When morning came, we were still there on the lounge. I fixed us some coffee and toast. I told her to beat it back to her house and gather up anything she wanted to take with her. She left, hurrying, and I went back into the bedroom. I stuffed all of Joyce's things into a big carton. I carried the box out into the alley and set it down by the trash can. Then I drove down to the store. Staples was alone. He gave me the silverware contract, and I struck a match to it, dropping it to the floor and kicking the ashes to pieces.
Such a messy fellow. But I suppose I shouldn't chide you. Your money, Frank. I'm making it a full $50.
I picked up the money, not saying anything. I gave him a slow, hard stare, and then I turned around and started to leave.
Frank?
There was a worried note in his voice.
What are your plans?
What's that to you?
But I've always been concerned for you, dear boy, always, and it's dawned on me that since you'll doubtless want to be moving on...
I began to get it. He was worried. He wasn't just another hired hand that could pull out without a moment's notice. The books would have to be audited and the stock inventoried before he could leave, and that would take 2 or 3 weeks at the inside, and he didn't like the idea of me being in town during that time. I might get desperate, see, might get drunk and jam myself up with the police and do a little talking. Why would I want to travel? I figure I'll stay right here. He gave me a peeved look, but he opened the cash drawer. He took out all the currency inside, counted it, and shoved it through the wicket.
$447, Frank, almost $500 with the 50 you have. That should see you well on your way.
I like it here. I'm not going anywhere.
Now, Frank.
Not unless you do a lot better than that. Hell, make it $1,000 anyway. With all you've got...
But I don't have it with me. It's put away in a safe place, and it's going to remain there until my resignation takes effect.
Write me a check, then. Give me your check for $500.
Must you really be so obvious? No checks. I couldn't oblige you even if I was stupid. It will take just about my entire bank balance to square with the cash draw.
I was sure he was lying, but there wasn't much I could do about it. He was just a little worried, not actually scared, and I'd played that worry for all it was worth. I picked up the money and left. I owed $230 on the car. I paid it off and went back to the house. Mona was there waiting for me. I got my stuff together and loaded all our baggage into the car. I'd always made out pretty well in Omaha, so that's where I headed for. We got there just after dark. We stopped at a diner for a bite to eat. The waitress brought me a newspaper. I glanced at it, and that was our last stop in Omaha. I started driving again, and I drove almost night and day to Des Moines. Across to Denver, I sold the car in Denver, and we started traveling by bus. Yeah, I suppose she wondered what the score was, or maybe she didn't. Anyway, she didn't ask any questions, and it was a damn good thing for her that she didn't. I'd had it, and it looked like I was going to keep right on getting it, because Staples had given the cops a bum steer, told them I had a seaman's ticket and probably intended to ship out. But that didn't help much. Nothing helped much. The crew haircut, the horn-rimmed glasses, the mustache. I was still scared as hell, afraid to settle down in one place. It was the lousiest stinking luck a guy ever had in his life. God damn it, it just wasn't fair. Did you ever hear of coal being moved by anything but regular freight? You're damn right you didn't. But that one car, they had to make an exception out of it. It got hooked on to an express freight, and it didn't stop until it got into Kansas City. It was in there at noon the next day, and they started unloading it right away. God damn them. And inside of an hour, the police doctor was posting the body. That soon, it was easy to fix the time of death, and they knew the body couldn't have been put on the train but one place, so they wired the cops at that place, and the cops started sniffing around. And they found that box of stuff in the alley by the trash can. I had to keep moving. My money was running out, and if I hadn't been saddled with her, goddamn tramp. Well, she finally started in on me. I didn't have it tough enough, I guess, so she had to make it tougher, watching me all the time like I was a goddamn freak or something, not saying anything unless I spoke to her, wearing me down little by little. The only thing she could do was bawl, and she never missed a chance at that. I was walking a little ahead of her that day in Dallas. I told her for God's sake if she wanted to look and act like a tramp she could walk by herself. So I was ahead of her, like I say, and finally I looked around and she wasn't there anymore. Hardly anyone was on the sidewalk anymore. They were all out on the street about a half a block back, crowded around the front of a big truck. Finally, I landed in Oklahoma City, and it looks like at last my luck has changed. Not with money. I was buying the gold door to door, and how can you make any money when everybody cheats you? But it looked like it had sure changed with women. I met her when I was working the swell apartment house there in the city. I sneaked in past the doorman, and hers was the first apartment I hit. Classy? Beautiful? Well, all I can say is that I'd never seen anything like her. I could hardly believe it when she smiled and asked me inside. I was ashamed to hit her up on the gold. I said I was looking for a party that used to live there, and I was sorry to have bothered her, and she laughed, nice and sympathetic.
Don't apologize for your job. Of course, I'm a little disturbed to see a gentleman of your personality and evident ability doing this kind of...
Well, it's just temporary, see? I got a little down on my luck, and I had to take what I could get.
How dreadful. You sit right down, and I'll fix you a nice drink.
I sat down on about $2,000 worth of lounge. She brought our drinks and sat down next to me. She smiled and kept the conversation going because naturally I was pretty speechless. I finished my drink and started to get up. She put her hand on my arm.
Please don't go. I've been so lonely since my husband died.
I said I was sorry to hear of her husband's death. Her eyes clouded up for a moment, and then she shook her head.
It's lonely without him, and naturally I didn't want him to die. But oh, it's a terrible thing to say. But I think I actually begun to hate him. He pretended to be everything I wanted, and then after we were married...
I know exactly what you mean,
Say it.
She whispered. She turned and threw her arms around me.
Say I'm your baby. Say anything to me. Do anything you like. But just don't go away.
And it was like a beautiful dream. Talk about dreams. But I'm kidding you negative. That was exactly how I came to meet the lovely Helene, my Princess Charming. Thus at last were two love-hungry souls united. You will notice that I haven't described her, but I can't, because she looked so many different ways. When she went out where anyone else could see her, she always looked the way she looked the first day I met her. But when we were alone, well, if I hadn't known it was her sometimes, I wouldn't have known it was the same woman. A goddamn bag. She had dozens of different outfits, clothes that a girl of 18 would wear, or a woman of 25 or 35, and so on. All complete from house dresses to evening gowns. And she had all these different kinds of makeup, hair pieces and eyelashes and brows and teeth caps, even little glass things to slip in over her eyes and change their color. It was kind of a hobby with her, see, making herself up in all those different ways, and right at the start it made me a little uneasy. I got to wondering what was real and what wasn't, and maybe if I saw her as she really was, one more bag like all the rest, I wouldn't be able to take it. But that was just at first. It could be no other way. I mean, she had to be beautiful and classy and all that a man desires in a woman. A bag and a flea bag, for Christ's sake. All the royal rooking I'd got from tramps I couldn't take anymore. After all the struggle, I had at least found my heart's desire. She inherited a pile of dough from her father, stole her brother-in-law's savings. But that's about all I ever found out about her or him. I never even learned his name, her maiden name. She acted embarrassed when I mentioned anything about her background, so I didn't do it more than a time or two. I figured that the old man had probably made his pile selling clap medicine or something like that, and naturally she was embarrassed. Her money was in a bank in another city, just where I don't know, hidden in the mattress. But whenever she ran short, she'd hop a plane to this city and draw out what she wanted and be back the same night. She'd gone after some dough the morning this story broke in the newspapers, a story about some people I used to know. And I laughed so goddamn hard when I read it that I almost busted a rib. Safe now, with a bag and a flea bag. The 20-year-old Sterling kidnap case appeared to be solved today with the arrest of an ex-store manager and admitted associate of the notorious Faraday gang. The suspect is H.J. Staples. More than $90,000 of the $100,000 ransom money was recovered from his swank Sarasota, Florida hotel suite. Staples first came under scrutiny of the authorities about 4 months ago, when several $100s in kidnap currency was deposited to the account of a store he then managed. Believing that the deposit was made as a feeler, law officials refrained from arresting him until he put a large sum into circulation. Ramona Sterling was the only child of multimillionaire oil man Arthur Sterling and his semi-invalid wife. 3 years old at the time, Ramona was snatched from the grounds of the family's Tulsa estate. The ransom of $100,000 was demanded and promptly paid, but an inexperienced newscaster revealed that the serial numbers of the currency had been recorded. With the divulging of this information, the Sterlings lost all contact with the kidnappers, and it is generally conceded that the child was murdered. Mrs. Sterling died less than 6 weeks after the kidnapping. Her husband went to his grave the following month. In the absence of heirs, the great Sterling fortune was claimed by the state. The suspect Staples quit his job some 3 months ago and began traveling about the country, making various small expenditures along the way. At last, convinced apparently the time had cooled off the hot money, he arrived in Florida yesterday and began to splurge. His arrest followed. Grilled by state, federal, and local officials, he told a wildly implausible story of how he came into possession of the money. Full details are not yet available, but it is known that his tale involved Ma Faraday and Frank Dillon, a former associate of Staples, who had been sought for several months in connection with the death of his wife and their unborn child. Officials place no credence whatsoever in the suspect's explanations. That Staples was once on excellent terms with the gangsters is acknowledged. It is pointed out, however, that the entire Faraday family was wiped out more than 2 decades ago, and that this being the case, Staples' statement that Dillon killed Ma for the ransom money is nothing short of ridiculous. Moreover, it was pointed out the Faradays were bank robbers. They were never known to have indulged in any other criminal activity. As for Dillon, authorities now believe that he was himself a murder victim, and he is no longer being sought as a fugitive. They theorized that he and Mrs. Dillon learned that Staples had the ransom cash, and that the latter killed both. Dillon's body, it was explained, could have been buried in a coal car which was destined for a conveyor-fed blast furnace. I laughed and laughed when I read that story. I felt good all day. And then evening came on, and I didn't laugh anymore, and I didn't feel good anymore. Because it was quite a tragedy when you got to thinking about it. And I guess you know I'm a soft-hearted son of a bitch. Yes, it was a terrible tragedy, and whoever was responsible for it ought to be jailed, making a guy want what he couldn't get, making him so he couldn't get much, but he'd want a lot, laying it all out for him, every place he turned, the swell cars, the clothes, and places to live, never letting him have anything, but always making him want, making him hate himself. And if a guy hates himself, how can he love anyone else? Helene came home, my fairy princess, and she saw I was feeling low, so she fixed me a big drink. After that, I began to get drowsy. I was sleepy. I went and stretched out on the bed, and she came in and sat down beside me. She had a big pair of shears in her hand, and she sat snipping the ends of her hair, staring down at me. I looked at her, my eyes dropping shut, and she made herself look like Joyce, and then like Mona, and then all the others. She said I'd disappointed her. I turned out like all her other men.
You deceived me,
she said.
You're no different from the rest, Fred, and you'll have to pay like the rest. Don't you want me to, darling?
I nodded, and she began unfastening and fumbling, and then she lowered the shears, and then she was smiling again and letting me see.
There.
She said.
That's much better, isn't it?
And then, nice as I'd been, she started laughing, screaming at me.